Welcome to Revenge Central. Today I will read 2 new revenge stories. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing, and let's get started with Story 1. I made my slumlord's life a living hell. Let me start by telling you who I am. My name is Marisol. I'm 34 years old, I have a 6-year-old daughter named Sophia, and up until about 2 years ago, I was the most tenant-compliant person you'd ever meet. I paid rent on the first of every month, never threw loud parties, kept my apartment clean, and never once complained about anything. I was the kind of tenant landlords dream about, and that's exactly why I got taken advantage of for as long as I did. I should also tell you that before all of this happened, I worked as a paralegal at a small family law firm downtown. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but I spent my days reading statutes, filing court documents, and digging through public records. So when the time came to go to war with my landlord, I had a pretty decent set of tools at my disposal. More on that later. This story starts in October of 2021. I'd just gone through a messy divorce, lost my house in the settlement, and needed a place to live fast. I was desperate, honestly. Sophia was starting kindergarten, I needed to stay in the same school district, and affordable apartments in our city were already getting ridiculous. I found a listing on one of those rental websites for a 2-bedroom unit in a 6-unit building on Maple Avenue. The rent was $850 a month, which was almost too good to be true for the neighborhood. It was too good to be true, obviously. My mom warned me, my sister warned me. Even the Uber driver who dropped me off at the viewing looked at the building and said, "You sure about this place, ma'am?" I was sure. I had to be sure. Desperation has a way of making you see what you need to see instead of what's actually there. The building looked like it hadn't been updated since sometime around the Reagan administration. The exterior was a sickly yellow-beige color that might have once been white. The front steps had a crack running down the middle, wide enough to catch a heel in. The iron railing on the porch was wobbly and had visible rust spots. There was a chain-link fence around the tiny backyard that was missing 2 panels, creating a gap wide enough for a child to walk through. The intercom system at the front door had been ripped out and replaced with a handwritten sign that said, "Ring unit you need." But the apartment itself, well, it had 2 bedrooms, it had a kitchen, it had a bathroom that mostly worked, and I was out of time. I met the landlord, a guy named Gerald Hoffman, for the first time at the lease signing. Gerald was probably in his late 50s, thick around the middle, with a permanently flushed face and thinning hair he combed over in a way that fooled absolutely nobody. He wore a stained polo shirt and khakis, and he had this way of talking to me that I can only describe as condescendingly casual. "Don't you worry about a thing, sweetheart," he said, sliding the lease across his cluttered dining room table. He'd set up a little makeshift office in the first-floor unit, which he told me was his property management headquarters. "I take real good care of my tenants. You need anything, you just call me direct." Sweetheart. Okay, I let it slide because I needed the apartment. The lease itself was one of those generic forms you can buy at any office supply store. The kind that's like 12 pages long and basically says, the landlord can do whatever they want and the tenant is responsible for everything. I noticed a few red flags even back then, and my paralegal instincts were already tingling. There was a clause that said I'd be charged a $200 cleaning fee upon move-out regardless of the apartment's condition. There was another clause that said all maintenance requests had to be submitted in writing and gave Gerald 30 days to respond. 30 days for a maintenance request. There was also a bizarre clause prohibiting tenants from having any water-filled furniture, which I assume meant waterbeds, but the way it was worded could have technically covered a fish tank or even a vase. And the early termination fee was equal to 3 months' rent, which is almost certainly unenforceable under state law, but most tenants don't know that. But I signed it. I was desperate. Sophia was with my mom that afternoon, and I had exactly 48 hours before I needed to be out of the old house. So I signed, wrote a check for the first month's rent, plus a $1,000 security deposit, and got my keys. Gerald told me the previous tenant had left in a hurry, and that the unit had been freshly cleaned. I walked in and found dust bunnies, the size of small mammals in every corner, a mysterious stain on the bedroom carpet that looked suspiciously biological, and a kitchen that smelled like someone had fried fish in it approximately 3 years ago and never opened a window since. The bathroom faucet dripped constantly, one of the stove burners didn't work, and the bedroom window had a crack running through it that someone had patched with clear packing tape. But again, 2 bedrooms, right school district, $850 a month. I unpacked my life and tried to make it home. For the first few weeks, things were manageable. I cleaned everything top to bottom. I put down area rugs over the stained carpet. I bought a little space heater because the radiator in Sophia's room didn't work. I fixed the dripping faucet myself, with a YouTube tutorial and a $15 part from the hardware store. I was making it work. That's what single moms do, right? We make it work. Then November came, and with it, the first real test. Sophia and I were sitting in the living room one evening watching Bluey, because Bluey is God's gift to parents and I will not be taking questions at this time, when I heard this sound. It was a kind of low, gurgling, bubbling noise coming from the bathroom. I went to investigate and found water. Water everywhere. The toilet had backed up, and not just a little. I'm talking sewage water rising out of the bowl and spilling across the bathroom floor, seeping under the door and into the hallway. I grabbed Sophia, grabbed my phone, and called Gerald. He didn't answer. I called again. No answer. I texted him. Gerald, there's sewage backing up into my bathroom. This is an emergency. Please call me back immediately. 45 minutes later, he texted back. Try plunging it. These old pipes are sensitive. I stared at my phone like it had personally insulted me. There was actively raw sewage on my bathroom floor and this man was telling me to use a plunger. I did try the plunger. The water level went down for about 3 minutes and then came back up with a vengeance, this time bringing with it the distinct aroma of every tenant's waste from the past decade. I called Gerald again. This time he picked up, and I could hear what sounded like a basketball game on TV in the background. Yeah, what's going on? He said, like I was interrupting something important. Gerald, I told you, there's sewage in my apartment. My daughter is here. This is a health hazard. Okay, calm down. Look, it's probably just a clog. I'll send my guy over tomorrow. Tomorrow? Gerald, I can't live with sewage on my floor tonight. Marisol, I got 6 units to manage. I can't be everywhere at once. My plumber is booked up today. He'll be there first thing in the morning. I spent that night with towels shoved under the bathroom door. Every window in the apartment cracked open despite it being November, and Sophia sleeping in my bed with me because her room was right next to the bathroom and the smell was creeping in. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sewage spreading further, seeping into the carpet, into the walls, into places I'd never be able to clean. I was up at 5 in the morning scrubbing the bathroom floor with bleach for the 2nd time that night. Sophia, bless her, woke up and asked if we could have waffles for breakfast, completely oblivious to the fact that her mother was having a nervous breakdown next to a toilet that belonged in a horror movie. The plumber did show up the next morning, if you could call the guy who showed up a plumber. His name was Dale, and he looked like he'd been pulled out of a bar at 9 in the morning, which maybe he had. He had a single plunger and a bottle of Drano. That was it. That was his entire toolkit. Dale plunged the toilet for about 10 minutes, poured in some Drano, shrugged, and said, "Should be fine now." It was not fine. It was fine for about 6 hours and then it happened again. This cycle repeated itself for an entire week before I lost my mind and called a licensed plumbing company myself. They sent out a guy named Roberto, who actually knew what he was doing, and within 20 minutes he'd snaked the main line and pulled out what he described as about 40 years of accumulated grease, hair, and what I sincerely hope is just roots. Roberto also told me something that stuck with me. He said, "Lady, this whole building's plumbing is a disaster. I can see why you're having problems. The main sewer line is partially collapsed and has been for probably years. Your landlord should have replaced it a long time ago." I asked him to put that in writing, and to my surprise, he did. Roberto gave me a written assessment that said the building's main sewer line was in critical disrepair and needed immediate replacement. He estimated the cost at around $12,000 to $15,000. I sent a copy of this assessment to Gerald, along with a polite but firm email stating that I was deducting the $350 plumbing bill from my next month's rent under the repair and deduct provisions of our state's landlord-tenant law. Gerald called me within 10 minutes of receiving that email. "You can't do that," he said. You can't just deduct from rent. That's not how this works. Actually, Gerald, under state law, when a landlord fails to address a condition that affects health and safety within a reasonable time frame, the tenant has the right to hire a professional to make the repair and deduct the cost from rent. I gave you a week. Sewage on my floor is a health hazard. I have the plumber's written assessment and the invoice. This is all legal. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know what? Fine, deduct it. But this is a one-time thing. Don't get any ideas." Oh, Gerald, I was just getting started. That first maintenance disaster opened my eyes, but I still wasn't fully awake yet. I was annoyed, sure, but I figured it was an isolated incident. A crappy old building with crappy old pipes. What are you gonna do, right? I kept my head down, kept paying rent, and tried to focus on getting my life back together after the divorce. Then, the heat went out in January. Not partially out. Not sort of working. Completely, totally, absolutely out. The building had an old boiler system, and one morning I woke up and it was 52 degrees in my apartment. Sophia was shivering. I could see my breath. I checked the radiators, cold as ice. I texted Gerald, "The heat is out. It's freezing in here. Sophia is 6 years old. Please send someone to fix this today." His response, "Boiler's probably just acting up. I'll have Dale look at it this weekend." This was a Tuesday. In January, in the Midwest. I want to be very clear about how cold it was. The high temperature that day was 19 degrees, 19. And my landlord was telling me to wait until the weekend. I called the city's non-emergency line and was transferred to the housing department. I was on hold for about 20 minutes, during which I listened to the same instrumental version of "What a Wonderful World" on repeat until I wanted to scream. But I stayed on hold, because that's what you do when you're a single mom with a cold kid and no other options. Finally, a woman answered, and I explained the situation. She told me something that would change my entire approach to this problem. She said, "Ma'am, under City Municipal Code Section 842, landlords are required to maintain heating equipment in operable condition and maintain a minimum indoor temperature of 68 degrees between September 15th and May 15th. If your landlord fails to do so, you can file a formal complaint, and we'll send an inspector out within 48 hours. I filed the complaint that same day. I also documented everything. I took photos of the thermostat showing 52 degrees. I took a video of Sophia bundled up in her winter coat inside the apartment. I kept a log of every text message and phone call with Gerald. I was a paralegal, remember. Documentation was second nature to me. The city inspector came out 2 days later. His name was Frank, and he was a no-nonsense guy who'd clearly seen it all. He walked through my apartment, checked the boiler in the basement, and immediately issued 3 violations: failure to maintain heat, failure to maintain the heating system in operable condition, and an additional violation for a broken smoke detector I didn't even know about until he pointed it out. He gave Gerald 14 days to comply. Gerald was furious. He called me and yelled. Actually yelled. "You called the city on me? Are you kidding me? I've been a landlord in this neighborhood for 20 years and nobody's ever—" "Gerald," I interrupted. "It was 34 degrees outside and my daughter was wearing a winter coat indoors. I gave you notice. You didn't respond. I have a legal right to a habitable apartment. This isn't personal." "It is personal. You're trying to screw me." "I'm trying to not freeze to death. There's a difference." He hung up on me. The heat came back on the next day. Dale showed up with some space heaters and a part for the boiler that he clearly had no idea how to install. It took him 2 tries, but eventually the heat kicked back on. I didn't say thank you. Now here's where things started to get interesting. While all of this was happening, I was getting to know my neighbors. I'd been so wrapped up in my own problems that I hadn't really made an effort to connect with anyone in the building. That changed after the heat incident, because suddenly, everyone was talking about it. The building had 6 units. There was Mrs. Chen in 1B, an elderly woman who'd lived there for 15 years and spoke mostly Mandarin with a smattering of English. She was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, with silver hair and the kind of warm smile that made you feel like you'd known her your whole life. There was a young couple, Devin and Aisha, in 2A, who'd moved in about 6 months before me. Devin worked in IT, and Aisha was a nursing student. They were both in their mid-20s and still had that optimistic energy that I remembered having at that age, before life started throwing haymakers. There was Marcus in 2B, a single guy who worked nights at a warehouse and kept to himself mostly, but was always polite when you ran into him in the hallway at weird hours. And there was a woman named Patty in 3A, who I'd occasionally see in the hallway but didn't know well at first. It was Mrs. Chen who first told me about the deposit situation. I ran into her in the lobby one afternoon and we got to talking, mostly through hand gestures and my very limited Spanish, which sometimes overlaps with Mandarin communication strategy. She showed me a letter she'd received from Gerald when she'd tried to move out 2 years earlier. The letter stated that she was being charged $1,800 for damages and cleaning, and that her entire $900 deposit was being withheld. Plus, she owed an additional $900. Mrs. Chen's apartment was immaculate. This woman scrubbed her floors on her hands and knees every single morning. I'd seen her. There was no way she'd caused $1,800 in damages. I asked Devin and Aisha about their experiences. Devin told me that before they moved in, they'd talked to a former tenant who warned them about Gerald's deposit practices. The guy before us said Gerald kept his entire deposit and then some. Said he charged him for repainting the whole apartment even though the paint was already peeling when he moved in. Aisha chimed in. We took photos of everything when we moved in, because of that warning. Good thing too, because when we mentioned we might be moving out early, Gerald suddenly started sending us texts about pre-existing damage. Marcus, the quiet night shift guy, had his own story. He'd been there for 3 years and had never once gotten his security deposit back from a previous rental, not from Gerald, but from another landlord in the area. He said he didn't have the time or energy to fight it. Lawyers cost money I don't have, he said, shrugging. I told him lawyers weren't always necessary. Then I talked to Patty. Patty was in her 50s, worked as a school bus driver, and had the energy of someone who had been putting up with nonsense her entire life and had simply decided she was done. When I mentioned the heating violations and the sewage backup, her eyes got wide. Oh, honey, she said. That's just the tip of the iceberg with Gerald. You know he doesn't even have a rental license for this building, right? I stopped walking. What do you mean he doesn't have a rental license? I mean the city requires landlords to register their rental properties and get an annual license. It's like $50 a year or something. Gerald hasn't registered this building since 2016. I looked it up when I moved in because a friend of mine works at City Hall and told me to always check. He's been operating illegally for years. My paralegal brain went into overdrive, operating an unlicensed rental property. That was a big deal. In our city, it meant Gerald couldn't legally collect rent, couldn't file eviction proceedings, and was subject to daily fines for every day the property was unlicensed. This was potentially huge. I went home that night and started researching. And I do mean researching. I spent the next 3 weeks doing deep dives into every single aspect of landlord-tenant law, city codes, property records, and tax records that I could get my hands on. I treated it like a case at work, except this case was personal. Here's what I found, piece by piece, like assembling the world's most infuriating puzzle. First, the rental license. I went to the city's website and searched the property address in the rental registration database. The last valid license was issued in 2016 and had expired in 2017. There had been no renewal since. I printed the search results, which showed "no active license" in bright red letters. I also found the city ordinance that established the licensing requirement, which clearly stated that operating an unlicensed rental property was a municipal infraction punishable by fines of $100 to $500 per day per unit. With 6 units, that was potentially $600 to $3,000 per day in fines for every single day Gerald had been operating without a license. Doing the rough math, 5 years of unlicensed operation, 365 days a year, 6 units, even at the minimum fine, that was over $1 million in potential liability. $1 million. Second, the property taxes. Our county has an online property records search, and I pulled up Gerald's building. The property tax records showed that he hadn't paid property taxes in full for 3 consecutive years. He'd made partial payments that covered maybe 60% of what he owed, leaving a growing tax lien against the property. The outstanding balance was around $14,000 and climbing because unpaid taxes accrue interest and penalties. If the county chose to enforce the lien, they could eventually force a tax sale of the property. This was public information, free to anyone who knew where to look. Third, the building permits. I went down to City Hall and requested the permit history for the property. You know what I found? Nothing. Not a single building permit on file for any work done to the building in at least 20 years. The plumbing, the electrical, the roof, whatever repairs or modifications had been done, none of them had been permitted or inspected. The boiler that had failed in January? No permit for its installation or replacement. The electrical panel in the basement, which I now noticed looked like something out of a Frankenstein movie? No permit. The second-story porch that had a visible sag when you stood on it? No permit. Fourth, the code violations. Using the city's online portal, I searched for any existing code violations on the property. There were 2 open violations from 2019, one for a broken handrail on the back stairs and one for peeling lead paint, that had never been resolved. The fines had been accruing interest for 3 years. Fifth, the deposit theft. This one required more legwork. I posted in a local community Facebook group, one of those neighbors groups where people complain about parking and share pictures of raccoons, and asked if anyone had rented from Gerald Hoffman in the past few years. I got 47 responses. 47. Some were current tenants, some were former tenants, and the stories were remarkably consistent. Gerald routinely withheld security deposits in full, often claiming damages that were clearly pre-existing or normal wear and tear. Several former tenants said he'd demanded additional money beyond the deposit before returning their keys. One woman said he'd kept her deposit and then sent her to a collections agency for an additional $500 in cleaning fees for an apartment she'd left spotless. I documented every single response. I took screenshots. I asked people to email me their stories directly so I'd have a paper trail. 12 former tenants sent me detailed accounts, complete with copies of lease agreements, move-in/move-out checklists, and the letters Gerald had sent them about their deposits. In several cases, the damage Gerald cited was identical from tenant to tenant: the same scratched floor, the same stained carpet, the same broken blinds. He was literally using a template to steal deposits from people. Sixth, the corporate structure. Gerald didn't own the building in his own name. He'd set up an LLC, Hoffman Properties LLC, which I discovered by searching the Secretary of State's business registry. But here's the thing. The LLC's registration had lapsed. In our state, LLCs are required to file an annual report and pay a small fee to maintain their status. Hoffman Properties LLC hadn't filed an annual report since 2018. This meant the LLC was administratively dissolved, which created a whole mess of legal issues around whether Gerald could even legally enforce the lease or collect rent in the LLC's name. I sat at my kitchen table one night after Sophia had gone to bed, surrounded by printed documents and highlighted statutes, and I realized I had enough ammunition to bury this man. Not illegally, not vindictively, well, maybe a little vindictively, but entirely within the bounds of the law. Gerald had been running this building like his personal ATM, cutting corners, breaking laws, and exploiting people who didn't have the time, knowledge, or resources to fight back. I had a 3-ring binder organized by category: code violations, tax records, business filings, tenant testimonies, and communications. It was thick. It was thorough. It was the kind of evidence packet that would make a prosecutor's day. Not anymore. Not on my watch. I started with the rental license complaint. I went to the city's housing department in person this time, brought my printed evidence, and filed a formal complaint about the unlicensed operation. The woman at the counter, a different woman from my first phone call, looked at my paperwork, looked at me, and said, "Honey, you've done more research than most of our inspectors." "I used to do this for a living," I said, smiling. The complaint triggered an investigation, which meant another inspection. This time, the inspector wasn't just looking at my unit. He was looking at the entire building. Frank, the same inspector from the heating complaint, came back, and he brought a buddy. They spent 3 hours going through every common area, every unit, with the tenant's permission, the basement, the roof, and the exterior. The violation notice they issued was, and I'm quoting Frank here, one of the longest I've written in 15 years. There were 23 individual violations. 23! Let me list some of the highlights because they're honestly impressive in their scope. No working smoke detectors in 3 of the 6 units. No carbon monoxide detectors anywhere in the building. Exposed wiring in the basement electrical panel. A stairway handrail that was completely detached from the wall on the second floor back staircase. Lead paint peeling in multiple common areas. This is a huge deal because there's federal law around lead paint disclosure that carries massive penalties. A back porch that had rotted support posts and was visibly sagging. A basement with standing water and visible mold growth. A missing GFCI outlet in the kitchen of every unit. This is a modern electrical code requirement. A water heater that wasn't properly vented, creating a carbon monoxide risk. Fire escape routes that were partially blocked by Gerald's storage of old furniture and appliances. And my personal favorite, the exterior door locks on 2 units didn't actually latch properly, meaning they could be pushed open with minimal force. Frank told me privately, this building should probably be condemned. But that process takes time. For now, we're giving him 60 days to fix all of this, or we'll start the condemnation proceedings. 60 days. Gerald had 60 days to address 23 code violations, some of which required thousands of dollars in professional repairs. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Gerald's response to the violation notice was predictable. He called me, screaming. I let him scream for about 2 minutes. Then I said, Gerald, I didn't cause these violations. You did, by neglecting this building for years. The city found these problems, not me. You're the one who called them. This is your fault. I'm a tenant. I have a legal right to report code violations. And frankly, Gerald, some of these are safety issues. The carbon monoxide risk alone could have killed someone. He hung up. Then he texted me, you're gonna regret this. I'll find a reason to evict you. That text was the best gift he could have given me, because retaliation against a tenant for reporting code violations is illegal in our state, and I now had it in writing. I screenshot that text so fast it would make your head spin. Over the next few weeks, Gerald half-assed his way through some of the violations. He bought cheap smoke detectors from the dollar store, the kind that are basically useless, and slapped them on walls with double-sided tape. He had Dale fix the handrail by nailing it back to the wall with finishing nails that could pull out with a firm tug. He cleaned some of the visible mold off the basement wall, but didn't address the water intrusion that was causing it. He put a new lock on one of the exterior doors, but not the other. Frank came back for the follow-up inspection and was not impressed. He reissued 12 of the 23 violations as still non-compliant, and added 2 new ones for the inadequate smoke detectors and the improperly repaired handrail. He also issued Gerald a formal warning that continued non-compliance would result in per-day fines and potential condemnation proceedings. I could see Gerald starting to sweat, and not just because it was getting warmer outside. The fines were adding up. Each day those violations remained open, he was racking up penalties. And that was on top of the unlicensed rental property fines, which were also accruing daily. But here's where the story really kicks into gear. Because Gerald decided to fight dirty, and that was the biggest mistake he could have made. In early March, about 2 weeks after the second inspection, I came home from work and found a notice taped to my door. It was a 3-day notice to cure for non-payment of rent. According to Gerald, I owed him for the month of March, plus the $350 I'd deducted for the plumbing repair back in November. I hadn't paid March rent yet because it was only March 3rd. Rent wasn't due until the 5th. And the plumbing deduction was legal. I'd properly documented it. I'd sent him the invoice and the plumber's assessment. This was pure retaliation, and it was so blatantly retaliatory that I almost laughed. Instead of laughing, I called my boss. Not my landlord, my boss at the law firm. I explained the situation, and she connected me with one of the attorneys who did landlord-tenant work on the side. His name was David, and when I showed him my documentation, he got this gleam in his eye that I recognized because I got the same gleam when I found a really good piece of evidence. Marisol, David said, leaning back in his chair. "This guy is in so much trouble. This eviction notice is retaliatory on its face. You reported code violations, he got hit with a massive violation notice, and 2 weeks later he's trying to evict you? Any judge in this county would throw this out in 30 seconds. But more than that, retaliatory eviction attempts are separately actionable under state law. You could counterclaim for damages." "Let's do it," I said. "Let's do more than that," David said. "How many other tenants are involved?" I told him about Mrs. Chen, Devin and Aisha, Marcus and Patty. I told him about the 47 Facebook responses and the 12 detailed accounts from former tenants. I told him about the unlicensed operation, the unpaid taxes, the lapsed LLC, and the 23 code violations. David's gleam got brighter. "I think we need to have a tenant meeting," he said. We scheduled it for the following Saturday afternoon in the building's small lobby area. I personally invited every current tenant, and David agreed to come pro bono, completely free, because he said this case was too good to pass up. And I don't mean good in a fun way. I mean legally airtight in a way that made it a satisfying case to pursue. 5 of the 6 current tenants showed up. Mrs. Chen brought her granddaughter to translate. Devin and Aisha came together. Marcus was there, looking like he'd just woken up, which he probably had. Patty brought cookies, because of course Patty brought cookies. Even the tenant in 1A, a guy named Kevin who I hadn't really talked to before, showed up. David explained everyone's rights in plain, non-lawyer language, and he was really good at it. He'd clearly done this kind of community outreach before. He explained that Gerald's eviction notice against me was retaliatory and illegal, and that the statute provided for actual damages plus punitive damages in retaliatory eviction cases. He explained that every tenant had the right to withhold rent or use repair and deduct for serious habitability issues, and that the burden of proof was on the landlord to show the unit was habitable, not on the tenant to prove it wasn't. He explained that Gerald's unlicensed status meant we might have a legal argument that we didn't even owe him rent, since you can't legally collect rent on an unlicensed rental property in our city. He explained that the deposit withholding pattern was potentially criminal, not just civil, because it involved systematically defrauding tenants, which could be prosecuted as theft by deception. He also mentioned that if any of the tenants had received federal housing assistance, Gerald's violations could trigger additional penalties under federal law. The room was quiet for a long time after David finished. Then Patty said, "So, what you're telling me is, we could sue this guy into next week?" "What I'm telling you," David said, "is that you could collectively sue this guy into next year. Here's what we did, step by step, and I want to be specific because this is the part people always want to know about. Step 1. Every tenant filed individual code violation complaints with the city, not just for their own units, but for every common area issue they'd observed. This created a flood of complaints that triggered yet another inspection and put additional pressure on the city to act aggressively. Step 2. We filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division about the pattern of deposit withholding. This was the big gun. The AG's office had the power to investigate Gerald's practices across all of his properties, not just our building, and as it turned out, Gerald owned 4 other rental properties in the city, 4 more buildings, each with the same likely issues. Step 3. David sent Gerald a formal demand letter on behalf of the tenant association. The letter was printed on thick, official law firm letterhead and was 9 pages long. It detailed every violation, every illegal practice, and every potential legal claim. It cited specific statutes, specific code sections, and specific case law. It demanded that Gerald return all wrongfully withheld security deposits to current and former tenants, bring the building into full code compliance within 30 days, obtain a valid rental license, and pay each current tenant $2,000 in compensation for the habitability issues they'd endured. The total demand was for something like $85,000. At the bottom, David had included a deadline and a warning that failure to comply would result in litigation, and a referral to the state bar for investigation of Gerald's attorney's conduct in filing the retaliatory eviction. Gerald's response to the demand letter was to call David and threaten to sue him for extortion. David, who had been doing this for 20 years, just laughed and said, Gerald, this isn't extortion. This is a demand letter. You can comply or you can face a lawsuit. Those are your options. I'd recommend the first one. Gerald did not comply. Gerald decided to double down, and that's when things went from bad to worse for him. In April, Gerald hired his own attorney, a guy named Bradley, who worked out of a strip mall office and had the worst Yelp reviews I've ever seen. Bradley filed a motion to dismiss my retaliatory eviction claim and countersued for unpaid rent. David responded with a motion that was, and I'm not exaggerating, 60 pages long. It detailed every single violation, included copies of every text message, every inspection report, every code citation, and every tenant testimony. David later told me that writing that motion was one of the most satisfying experiences of his legal career. The judge, a woman named Judge Reyes who had a reputation for being tough on slumlords, threw out Gerald's eviction attempt in a hearing that lasted about 15 minutes. She looked at Gerald's attorney and said, "Counselor, your client filed this eviction notice 2 weeks after the tenant reported code violations to the city, 2 days after a 23 violation notice was issued, and the rent in question wasn't even late yet. This is retaliatory on its face, and you know it." Motion denied. Counterclaim for damages is allowed to proceed. Gerald looked like he was going to pass out right there in the courtroom. His attorney, Bradley, was already sweating through his cheap suit. But that was just the beginning. The AG's office investigation had kicked into gear, and they'd sent investigators to Gerald's other 4 properties. The results were almost comically bad. Every single one of his buildings had similar issues: no rental license, unresolved code violations, unpermitted work, and tenants who'd been exploited. The AG's office found that Gerald had withheld over $40,000 in security deposits across his 5 properties over the past 6 years. That's not a typo, $40,000 in stolen deposits. The AG issued a formal investigation notice to Gerald in May, which was a public document. I know because I checked. And I also knew that when a property owner is under formal investigation by the AG, it becomes very difficult to sell, refinance, or insure the property. Gerald's financial options were starting to dry up. Around this same time, I'd been in touch with a reporter named Christine from the local newspaper. I'd reached out to her because I'd read her series on housing issues in the city, and I thought Gerald's story was right up her alley. Christine came out to the building, interviewed me and several other tenants, reviewed our documentation, and spent a week investigating Gerald's other properties and his history. The article came out on a Sunday morning in June, front page of the local section. The headline was, "Slumlord's Empire: How One Landlord Exploited Tenants Across the City While City Officials Looked the Other Way." It was a long, detailed, devastating piece of journalism. Christine had clearly done her homework. She'd pulled property records, court filings, business registrations, and tax documents. She'd interviewed former tenants, current tenants, city officials, and a housing policy expert from the local university. She'd even tracked down Gerald's ex-wife, who told Christine, on the record, that Gerald had a pattern of cutting corners and taking advantage of people that extended back decades. It named Gerald. It named his properties. It quoted tenants by name. It included the code violations, the AG investigation, the stolen deposits, and the unpaid taxes. The article went viral locally, like seriously viral. It was shared thousands of times on social media, picked up by a couple of regional news outlets, and even got a brief mention on one of the local TV stations. Gerald's photo, pulled from his long-neglected business website, was plastered all over Facebook and Twitter. The comments were brutal. Former tenants came out of the woodwork to share their own Gerald Hoffman horror stories. A city council member quoted the article at a public meeting and demanded an investigation into why the city's housing department hadn't acted sooner. Gerald called me the day after the article came out. He didn't yell this time. His voice was quiet, almost shaky. "Marisol, why are you doing this to me?" I thought about that question for a moment before answering. "Gerald, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm reporting violations that already existed. I'm exercising my legal rights as a tenant. You did this to yourself by running your properties illegally and treating people like garbage. I'm just the person who finally had the time and the knowledge to do something about it. I could lose everything," he said. "You could have taken care of your buildings. You could have returned people's deposits. You could have gotten a rental license. You could have paid your taxes. You had options, Gerald. You chose to exploit people instead. He hung up, and I didn't hear from him directly again for months, but the legal machinery kept grinding. Over the summer of 2022, things accelerated rapidly. The city, now under enormous public pressure from the newspaper article and the city council's demands, revoked Gerald's ability to collect rent on all of his properties until he came into full compliance. That's right. They essentially told him he couldn't collect rent on any of his 5 buildings until every single code violation was resolved and all of his properties were properly licensed. This was a nuclear option that the city rarely used, and it meant Gerald was suddenly bleeding money from 5 properties with zero income. The AG's investigation concluded in August with a formal complaint and a settlement offer. The AG was willing to forego criminal charges if Gerald agreed to return all wrongfully withheld deposits with interest, pay a $75,000 civil penalty, and bring all of his properties into full compliance within 90 days. Gerald, through his increasingly desperate attorney Bradley, tried to negotiate the penalty down. The AG's office said no. The settlement offer was take it or leave it. Gerald couldn't take it. He didn't have $75,000. He probably didn't have $7,500. The man had been running his empire on a shoestring, squeezing every penny out of his properties while putting nothing back in. He'd been using rental income to fund what I can only describe as a lifestyle that didn't match his actual financial situation. Country club membership, a boat, a relatively new truck, all while his buildings crumbled and his tenants suffered. In September, the county moved to enforce the tax lien on the Maple Avenue property. This was separate from everything else. The county doesn't care about code violations or the AG's investigation. They just want their tax money. With over $14,000 in unpaid taxes, plus interest and penalties, the county initiated tax lien proceedings that would eventually lead to a tax sale if the debt wasn't paid. Gerald was now facing daily fines from the city for code violations and unlicensed operation, a $75,000 AG penalty, a county tax lien proceeding, the cost of bringing 5 buildings into compliance, which a contractor estimated at well over $200,000 across all properties, and our collective civil lawsuit for damages, which was still working its way through the courts. In October 2022, almost exactly 1 year after I'd moved in, Gerald put the Maple Avenue building up for sale. But here's the thing about selling a building that's under active investigation, has 20-plus open code violations, is subject to a tax lien, and was just featured in a front-page newspaper exposé about being a slumlord property. Nobody wants to buy it. Or rather, the only people who want to buy it are the vulture investors, who offer pennies on the dollar because they know the seller is desperate. The building's assessed value was about $380,000. Gerald initially listed it for $350,000. After 2 months with 0 offers, he dropped it to $300,000, then $275,000, then $250,000. He got 1 offer at $200,000 from an investor who wanted to flip it, but the deal fell through during the inspection phase when the buyer's inspector found, you guessed it, massive code violations and structural issues. Gerald eventually accepted an offer of $185,000 from a local nonprofit housing organization that specialized in buying distressed properties and renovating them into affordable housing. They were the only buyer who'd stuck around through the due diligence process, and frankly, they were doing Gerald a favor by even making an offer. The sale closed in February 2023. Gerald had paid, according to property records I pulled, $310,000 for the building in 2009. He sold it for $185,000. That's a loss of $125,000, not counting the tens of thousands he'd spent on lawyers, fines, and penalties over the past year. When you factored in the attorney's fees, the fines to the city, the AG settlement, the court costs, and the tax lien payoff, Gerald probably walked away from the Maple Avenue building having lost close to $200,000 in total. He sold his other 4 properties over the following 6 months, all at significant losses. The last one went for barely more than what he owed on the mortgage. By the end of 2023, Gerald Hoffman was no longer a landlord. He'd lost his entire portfolio. Our collective lawsuit settled in March 2023 for a total of $62,000 to be distributed among the current and former tenants who joined the case. My share was $8,500, which covered the plumbing bill, the rent I'd withheld during the worst of the habitability issues, and then some. Mrs. Chen got $12,000 because she'd been there the longest and had endured the most. Devin and Aisha got $9,000 between them. Marcus got $6,500. Patty got $7,000. Kevin got $5,000. The former tenants who'd provided testimony got smaller amounts, ranging from $1,000 to $3,000 each. The new owners of the Maple Avenue building, the nonprofit housing organization, were everything Gerald wasn't. They renovated the entire building top to bottom over the course of about 8 months. New plumbing, new electrical, new roof, new windows, new everything. They got proper permits for all the work, obtained a valid rental license, and brought the building fully up to code. The transformation was honestly incredible. The gross yellow-beige exterior got a fresh coat of crisp white paint. The front steps were repaired. The chain-link fence was replaced. They even put in a little community garden in the backyard, where Sophia and I used to look at the missing fence panels and wonder if the neighborhood stray cats were using it as a door. They offered all of us the opportunity to stay with updated leases at fair market rent, which was now about $1,100 a month, higher than Gerald's $850, but for an apartment that actually had working plumbing, reliable heat, functioning smoke detectors, and a landlord who answered the phone, it was worth every penny. I stayed for another year and a half before buying a small condo with the settlement money and my savings. Mrs. Chen stayed. Devin and Aisha stayed until they bought a house in the suburbs. Patty stayed and became the unofficial building ambassador for the new management company, because of course she did. Sophia and I are doing great. She's in 3rd grade now, she still loves Bluey, and she has no idea that her mom spent a year of her life meticulously dismantling a slumlord's entire operation. She just knows that our new condo has a bathtub that drains properly and that the heat works in the winter. Which, honestly, is all she should need to know. I still think about Gerald sometimes. I don't feel bad about what happened to him. I know some people might read this and think I went too far, that I should have just moved out and found another place. But here's the thing. I could have moved. I'm educated, I had a decent job, I had resources. Mrs. Chen didn't. Some of those former tenants who got their deposits stolen didn't. The people Gerald exploited were overwhelmingly low-income, immigrant, and young families who didn't know their rights and couldn't afford lawyers. Gerald preyed on people who couldn't fight back. I could fight back, so I did. If you're reading this and you're in a similar situation, here's my advice, from someone who's been there. Document everything. Every text, every email, every phone call, every photo, every video. Get it in writing. Get it timestamped. If your landlord says something incriminating on the phone, follow up with a text, just to confirm our conversation. You said that. Learn your rights. Every state and most cities have landlord-tenant laws that are surprisingly tenant-friendly if you know how to use them. Your local legal aid office can help. There are also tons of free resources online. Talk to your neighbors. Landlords like Gerald rely on tenants being isolated from each other. When tenants organize, landlords lose their power. A single complaint is easy to dismiss. 20 complaints from an organized tenant association is a nightmare. Use the system. Code enforcement, housing departments, the Attorney General's office, the courts. These institutions exist for a reason. They're not perfect, and they're often underfunded and slow, but they work, especially when you show up with a thick folder of documentation and a lawyer who knows what they're doing. And finally, don't be afraid. Landlords count on tenants being too scared, too busy, or too ignorant to challenge them. The moment you stand up, the dynamic changes. I know it's hard. I know it's exhausting, especially when you're already juggling a job and kids and everything else life throws at you. But there are resources out there: legal aid societies, tenant rights organizations, housing clinics at law schools, and they exist specifically to help people in these situations. Not every story ends as satisfyingly as mine did, but every act of resistance makes it harder for the next slumlord to operate. Gerald Hoffman tried to intimidate me. He tried to evict me. He tried to make me feel like I was the problem. Instead, he lost 5 buildings, over $100,000 in fines and settlements, his reputation, and his livelihood. And I got a new condo with a really nice bathtub. I'd call that a win. Edit. A lot of people have been asking for specifics about the laws and codes I referenced. Here are some of the key ones, though keep in mind these vary by state and municipality. Your state's Landlord-Tenant Act. Every state has one. Just Google your state landlord-tenant law. City municipal code requirements for rental property licensing. Your state's repair and deduct statute. Your state's anti-retaliation protections for tenants. Federal lead paint disclosure requirements. 42 USC 4852D. Local building and housing codes. Also, several people have asked about David, my attorney. He's amazing, and if you're in the area and need a landlord-tenant lawyer, DM me and I'll send you his info. Edit 2. To the person who DM'd me to say I was just bitter about my divorce and taking it out on an innocent landlord, Gerald had raw sewage in my bathroom, lead paint peeling off the walls, and no working heat in January. That's not innocent. That's a hazard. Be for real. Edit 3. Yes, I know Bluey is Australian. That doesn't make it less of a god-tier children's show. Stop coming for Bluey in my comments. Thanks for reading. Stay warm, know your rights, and for the love of everything, don't let your landlord get away with crap. Peace. Story 2. The spreadsheet that ate my boss. There is a particular satisfaction that comes not from the act of revenge itself, but from the months of quiet, methodical preparation that precedes it. The world tells us to be impulsive, to rage, to scream. I chose spreadsheets instead, and on a Tuesday morning in March, in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building I had entered 1,000 times before, I watched 18 months of careful work reduce a man to nothing. Not a single raised voice was required. Not one threat was uttered. The data spoke, and my boss, Vice President Marcus Webb of Helix Data Systems, was escorted from the premises before lunch. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I want to be clear about that from the outset. I am, by training and temperament, a data analyst. I have spent my career looking at rows and columns, at trends and anomalies, at the stories that numbers tell when you arrange them properly. My instinct, when confronted with a problem, is not to react, it is to observe, to measure, to document. And when the problem happened to be my direct supervisor, a man who had made a career of appropriating the labor of others and laundering company funds through a constellation of phantom vendors, my instinct served me remarkably well. What follows is the complete account of how I brought down Marcus Webb. It is long, because the undertaking was long. It is detailed, because details were the weapon. And it is, I confess, deeply satisfying to write. I joined Helix Data Systems in February of 2021. At the time, the company was a mid-sized technology firm headquartered in Austin, Texas, with roughly 400 employees distributed across 3 offices. We specialized in business intelligence software, platforms that helped other companies make sense of their own data. It was the kind of company that generated enormous amounts of internal data and, ironically, paid very little attention to it. I was hired as a senior data analyst in the Business Operations Division, reporting directly to Marcus Webb, who held the title of Vice President of Strategic Analytics. The division was small, just 12 of us, but our work was consequential. We were responsible for the company's internal performance metrics, client delivery analytics, and the quarterly business reviews that the executive team presented to the board of directors. Marcus Webb was 47 years old when I met him. He was tall, lean, and had the kind of practiced charisma that serves executives well in rooms full of people who want to be impressed. He spoke in aphorisms. He had a firm handshake and a wardrobe of navy blazers. He had been with Helix for 6 years, having arrived from a director-level position at a larger firm in Seattle. His reputation, as far as I could tell from my interviews, was solid. The CEO, a woman named Catherine Osei, had personally recruited him. My first few months were, by all outward appearances, unremarkable. I settled into the role, learned the systems, and began producing the reports and analyses that were expected of me. I found the work engaging, the data was messy but interesting, and I had a talented team of colleagues around me. Marcus, for his part, seemed reasonably supportive during those early weeks. He attended my one-on-one meetings. He provided feedback on my deliverables, usually cursory, sometimes useful, occasionally wrong. He was not a micromanager, which I appreciated. He was, however, something I would only come to recognize much later, a collector. The first incident that should have alerted me occurred in May of 2021, roughly 3 months after my start date. I had spent 2 weeks building a comprehensive customer churn model, a predictive analytics tool that could identify which of our enterprise clients were most likely to cancel their contracts in the coming quarter. It was sophisticated work. I had used a gradient-boosted ensemble approach, validated against 18 months of historical data, and the model's accuracy was north of 87%. I was proud of it. I prepared a detailed presentation, complete with methodology slides, confidence intervals, and actionable recommendations for the customer success team. I sent the deck to Marcus on a Thursday afternoon, with a note saying I was happy to walk him through it before he shared it with the leadership team. He responded with a single line, "Looks great, I'll take it from here." The following Monday, Marcus presented the churn model to the executive leadership team in their weekly strategy meeting. I was not invited. I learned about the presentation secondhand from a colleague in the marketing department who mentioned that Marcus had knocked it out of the park with a brilliant piece of analysis he'd developed over the weekend. I was confused. I pulled up the slides that had been distributed to the leadership team and found that my name had been removed from every page. The methodology section had been simplified, dumbed down, honestly, but the core findings were identical to mine. The presenter was listed as Marcus Webb, VP of Strategic Analytics. There was no mention of my involvement whatsoever. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps he had intended to credit me verbally and simply forgot. Perhaps there was a protocol I wasn't aware of, where VPs presented their team's work as their own. I was new to the company. I didn't want to make waves. I sent Marcus a polite email asking about it. His response was characteristic of the man, warm in tone, empty in substance. "Great teamwork on that one," he wrote. "Let's keep the momentum going." I was left to interpret that as I wished. The pattern, once established, repeated itself with the reliability of a metronome. Over the following months, I produced a succession of analyses, pricing optimization models, market segmentation studies, operational efficiency audits, and each one followed the same trajectory. I would complete the work. I would deliver it to Marcus. Marcus would present it to the leadership team as his own. My name would vanish. By the fall of 2021, I had produced more than 24 major analyses, none of which carried my name in any official record. Marcus's reputation within the company, meanwhile, had grown considerably. He was being described in all-hands meetings as the analytical brain of Helix. Catherine Osei had begun citing his groundbreaking insights in investor communications. He had been given a seat on the company's strategic planning committee. I was, by comparison, invisible. My performance reviews, written by Marcus, naturally, were positive but generic. Meets expectations, solid contributor. There was no acknowledgement of the specific, substantial work I had done. When I raised the issue gently during a one-on-one in October, Marcus smiled and said, "I know it can feel like your work gets lost in the shuffle, but I assure you, leadership knows who the real talent is." He said this with the confidence of a man who had absolutely no intention of making sure leadership knew anything of the sort. I should note that I was not the only one experiencing this. My colleague, Priya Mehta, a brilliant data engineer who had built the company's entire real-time reporting pipeline, had been similarly erased. So had James Okonkwo, a financial analyst whose cost modeling work had directly informed the company's pricing strategy for 2 years. Marcus collected our output like a spider collecting flies, patiently, systematically, and without any apparent conscience. But credit theft, however galling, was not the worst of what Marcus Webb was doing. That discovery came later, and it arrived not through malice or suspicion, but through the very nature of my work. It was January of 2022 when I first noticed the anomaly. I was running a routine analysis of the company's vendor spending for the quarterly financial review, a task that involved pulling data from our accounts payable system and cross-referencing it against our approved vendor registry. It was tedious work, the kind of thing that most analysts would automate and then ignore. I had automated it, but I also had the habit of spot-checking the results, because automated systems are only as good as the assumptions baked into them. The anomaly was subtle. 3 vendor entries in the accounts payable system did not appear in the approved vendor registry. Their names were Tessera Consulting Group, Meridian Analytics Partners, and Northlight Data Services. Each had received multiple payments over the preceding year, totaling just over $412,000 combined. None of them had contracts on file in the company's procurement system. None of them had been through the vendor onboarding process that every other supplier to Helix had completed. I flagged this to Marcus during our weekly one-on-one. I showed him the data. I explained the discrepancy. He glanced at my screen for perhaps 5 seconds and said, "Oh, those are pre-approved vendors from before the current procurement system was implemented. They're grandfathered in. Nothing to worry about." It was a plausible answer. Companies accumulate legacy vendor relationships over time, and not all of them are meticulously documented. I accepted his explanation and moved on. But I did not forget about it. That is the thing about being a data analyst. Once you see something that doesn't fit, it lodges in your mind like a splinter. You can ignore it, but you can't stop feeling it. 3 months later, in April of 2022, I was asked to support the finance team in preparing for an external audit. The auditors, from a firm called Whitfield & Associates, had requested a complete listing of all vendor payments exceeding $10,000 over the previous 2 fiscal years. I pulled the data and, out of professional habit, ran the same cross-reference I had run in January. Tessera Consulting Group, Meridian Analytics Partners, and Northlight Data Services were still there. The total payments had grown to just over $600,000, and now I noticed something I had missed before. The payment authorizations for all 3 vendors had been approved by a single person, Marcus Webb. I looked more closely. The payments were distributed across the calendar, some monthly, some quarterly, some seemingly random, but they all followed a pattern. Each payment was for an amount just below the threshold that would require additional approval from the CFO's office. Each was categorized under consulting services or data analysis support, which were sufficiently vague to avoid scrutiny. And each was supported by an invoice that, when I pulled the scanned copies from the document management system, appeared to have been generated from the same template. The formatting was identical. The font was identical. The layout was identical. Only the names, dates, and amounts changed. I pulled the invoices for all 3 vendors and placed them side by side on my screen. The similarities were stark. The invoice numbers followed no discernible sequence. The descriptions of services rendered were vague to the point of meaninglessness: strategic analysis and advisory services, data infrastructure consultation, business intelligence optimization. There were no deliverables listed, no project codes, no timestamps, no evidence that any work had actually been performed. I then did something that I am certain Marcus never anticipated. I searched for domain registrations and business filings for each of the 3 companies. Tessera Consulting Group had a registered agent in Austin. Meridian Analytics Partners had a registered agent in Austin. Northlight Data Services had a registered agent in Austin. All 3 had been incorporated within a 12-month period. All 3 listed a mailing address that, when I looked it up on Google Maps, corresponded to a virtual office suite in a building on South Congress Avenue. I will not pretend that I did not feel a thrill of recognition in that moment. It was the particular electricity that comes when a hypothesis, formed instinctively, supported by pattern, crystallizes into something solid. Marcus Webb was not merely stealing credit. He was stealing money. He had created 3 fictitious companies, was approving payments to them from Helix's accounts, and was almost certainly pocketing the proceeds. The total, by my conservative estimate, was north of $600,000 over roughly 18 months. And it was ongoing. I want to be clear about what I did next, because it is the part of this story that matters most. I did not confront Marcus. I did not go to HR. I did not send an anonymous tip to the CFO. I did nothing impulsive, nothing reactive, nothing that would alert Marcus to the fact that I knew what he was doing. Instead, I made a decision. It was not an emotional decision, though it was certainly fueled by the quiet fury that had been building in me for nearly a year. It was a strategic decision, rooted in the same analytical framework that governed my professional work. I would document everything, systematically, comprehensively, and with the kind of evidentiary rigor that would make the case airtight. I had several reasons for this approach. First, Marcus was a vice president. He had the trust of the CEO and the board. An unsubstantiated accusation from a senior analyst, even one with compelling circumstantial evidence, would be easy for him to dismiss, deflect, or turn against me. Second, the financial fraud, if proven, was a criminal matter. I wanted the evidence to be thorough enough to survive legal scrutiny. Third, and I will admit this with full candor, I wanted Marcus to fall completely. Not a reprimand, not a quiet resignation. A total, irrevocable destruction of his professional reputation and career. Partial measures would not satisfy me. And so, on the evening of April 14, 2022, I sat at my desk in my apartment in East Austin, opened a fresh notebook, and began to plan. The documentation system I built over the following 18 months was, I believe, one of the most thorough personal investigative dossiers ever assembled by a single individual working without legal authority or institutional support. It was not a single spreadsheet, despite the title of this account. It was an ecosystem of interconnected documents, databases, and evidence files, organized with the same care I would bring to any major analytical project. The core of the system was a master spreadsheet, a single Excel workbook with 14 tabs, each serving a distinct purpose. I gave it an innocuous file name, Q2 performance.tracking versus v2.xlsx. It lived on an external hard drive that I kept in a fireproof safe in my apartment. I never accessed it on company equipment. I never emailed it to myself. I never discussed its contents with anyone who did not need to know. Tab 1 was the transaction ledger. Every payment made to Tessera Consulting Group, Meridian Analytics Partners, and Northlight Data Services recorded with the date, amount, authorization chain, invoice number, and GL code. I updated this tab weekly, pulling the data from our accounts payable system during normal working hours. Nobody questioned a data analyst reviewing vendor payment data. It was, after all, part of my job. Tab 2 was the invoice archive. I had downloaded copies of every invoice associated with the 3 vendors, 73 documents in total, and cataloged them with metadata noting formatting inconsistencies, missing information, and patterns that suggested a common origin. I also ran the invoices through a metadata extraction tool that revealed the creation dates, author names, and software used to generate them. Several of the invoices showed creation dates that were inconsistent with the dates printed on the documents themselves. Tab 3 was the corporate registry. This tab contained the business filing records for all 3 companies, pulled from the Texas Secretary of State's database. It included the registered agent information, the incorporation dates, the stated business purposes, and the names of the listed officers and directors. Marcus Webb's name did not appear on any of the filings, which told me he had been careful enough to use intermediaries. But the registered agent for all 3 companies was the same individual, a man named Douglas A. Parrish, whose name I would later learn was connected to Marcus through a series of property records and social media connections. Tab 4 was the bank account tracing log. This was the most difficult tab to populate because I did not have access to the vendors' bank accounts. What I did have, however, was the routing information from the ACH payment records in our accounts payable system. All 3 vendors, despite being ostensibly separate companies, received payments into accounts at the same financial institution, a regional bank based in San Antonio. The account numbers were different, but the bank was the same. It was a small clue, but it was a clue. Tab 5 was the communication log. Over the course of the 18 months, I documented every instance in which Marcus referred to or alluded to the 3 vendors in emails, meeting notes, or Slack messages. This was more challenging than it sounds, because Marcus was careful. He rarely discussed the vendors in writing, but he was not perfect. I found 3 email threads in which he referenced our external consulting partners in the context of budget discussions with the CFO. I found a Slack message in which he mentioned Tessera's latest deliverable to the VP of Product. These references were useful because they established that Marcus was the sole point of contact for all 3 vendors, a highly unusual arrangement for a company of Helix's size, where vendor relationships were typically managed by the procurement department. Tab 6 was the credit theft registry. This was the tab that documented every instance of Marcus presenting my work, or the work of Priya, James, or other team members, as his own. Each entry included the date of the original work product, the date of Marcus's presentation, the forum in which the presentation occurred, the specific content that was appropriated, and the names of any witnesses who might have been aware of the true authorship. By the time I was finished, this tab contained more than 40 entries spanning 2 years. Tab 7 was the pattern analysis. This tab contained the results of the statistical work I did to demonstrate that the payment patterns associated with the 3 vendors were inconsistent with legitimate consulting engagements. I compared the payment frequency, amounts, and timing against Helix's actual consulting contracts with known, legitimate vendors. The 3 phantom vendors received payments at irregular intervals that correlated with no discernible project milestones. The amounts were suspiciously uniform. The timing often coincided with periods of high company spending, when individual transactions were less likely to attract scrutiny. Tab 8 was the timeline, a comprehensive chronological record of every relevant event, from Marcus's arrival at Helix in 2019 through the present. This tab served as the backbone of the entire investigation, ensuring that every piece of evidence could be situated in its proper temporal context. Tab 9 was the witness inventory, a list of every current and former Helix employee who I believed had first-hand knowledge of Marcus's behavior, either the credit theft or the financial irregularities. For each person, I noted what they likely knew, how reliable I believed their testimony to be, and whether I had established contact with them. This tab would become critical during the alliance-building phase of the operation. Tab 10 was the legal research summary. I spent dozens of hours researching Texas corporate fraud statutes, federal wire fraud provisions, and the specific elements required to prove embezzlement and false pretenses in a corporate setting. I was not a lawyer, but I understood that the evidence I was gathering needed to meet certain thresholds to be actionable. This tab kept me focused on those requirements. Tab 11 was the risk assessment, a frank, unflinching analysis of the risks I was taking by conducting this investigation. I cataloged the possible consequences: retaliation, termination, legal action against me for accessing company data beyond my authorized scope, and evaluated the likelihood and severity of each. I also documented the steps I was taking to mitigate those risks, including my strict policy of never accessing data that was not within my legitimate job responsibilities. Tab 12 was the contingency plans. If Marcus discovered what I was doing, what would I do? If HR proved unresponsive, what was my next step? If the company attempted to suppress the information to avoid embarrassment, what external channels were available? I researched whistleblower protections under Texas law and federal Sarbanes-Oxley provisions. I identified the contact information for the FBI's white-collar crime division in Austin. I prepared a draft of a complaint that could be filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, given that Helix was privately held but had received venture capital from firms subject to regulatory oversight. Tab 13 was the presentation blueprint, a detailed outline of how I would present the evidence when the time came. This tab evolved significantly over the 18 months as I refined my understanding of the case and identified the most compelling narrative threads. It included draft slides, talking points, and anticipated objections with prepared responses. Tab 14 was the personal journal. This was the only tab that was not strictly evidentiary. It contained my private reflections, frustrations, and motivations. Reading it now, I can see the slow transformation in my thinking, from uncertainty to resolve, from anger to cold clarity. It is the tab that reminds me this was not a dispassionate exercise. I was hurt, I was furious, and I channeled every ounce of that fury into the spreadsheet. Building the spreadsheet was only half the work. The other half was building the alliances I would need to make the evidence stick. One person's word, however well documented, can be dismissed. 5 people's word, each corroborating the others, creates a narrative that is very difficult to refute. I began with Priya Mehta. Of everyone on the team, Priya was the most obvious target for Marcus's credit theft, because her work was the most technically sophisticated. The real-time reporting pipeline she had built was the foundation of Helix's entire client analytics infrastructure. Without it, the company would have been flying blind, And yet, in every external communication and board presentation, the pipeline was described as a strategic initiative led by VP Marcus Webb. I approached Priya in June of 2022, during a lunch at a taco truck on East Cesar Chavez Street. I chose the location carefully, public enough to feel casual, loud enough to prevent eavesdropping, far enough from the office to avoid accidental encounters with colleagues. I did not lead with the financial fraud. That would have been too alarming, too abrupt. I started with the credit theft. "You know he presented your pipeline architecture at the board meeting last week, right?" I said, as though it were a casual observation. Priya looked at me with an expression that was equal parts weariness and vindication. "Of course I know," she said. "He does it every quarter." "Does it bother you?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Does it bother me that I spent 8 months building something critical to this company's survival, and he puts his name on it like he typed the code himself? Yes, it bothers me. But what am I supposed to do? He's a VP. I'm a senior engineer. Who's going to believe me?" "I believe you," I said, "and I've been keeping records." That got her attention. I told her, in broad strokes, about the documentation I had been building. I did not show her the spreadsheet, not yet, but I described its scope and structure. I told her about the 3 phantom vendors and the $600,000. Her eyes widened, but she did not seem surprised. "That man has always struck me as someone who thinks the rules don't apply to him," she said. "I just didn't realize how far it went." Priya agreed to help. She began quietly collecting her own evidence, copies of commit logs showing her authorship of the pipeline code, time-stamped design documents, and email threads in which Marcus acknowledged receiving her work before presenting it as his own. She stored everything on a personal device and told no one. James Okonkwo was the next recruit. James was more cautious than Priya, a deliberate, thoughtful man who had been at Helix for 5 years and had a young family to consider. I did not approach him until August of 2022, after I had gathered enough evidence to make the case compelling. We met at a coffee shop in the Mueller neighborhood on a Saturday morning, and I laid out the situation with the same measured precision I had used with Priya. James listened carefully. He asked good questions. He expressed concern about retaliation. I showed him the risk assessment tab from my spreadsheet. Not the whole document, just that one tab, projected from my laptop onto a neutral background so that he could see the rigor with which I had considered the dangers. After a long silence, he said, "You know, I've been keeping my own notes. Not as organized as yours, but notes. Ever since he presented my cost model to the investors last spring and told them he'd built it over a weekend." James had kept a detailed personal log of every instance in which his work had been appropriated. It was informal, typed in a Word document on his personal laptop, but it corroborated my own records perfectly. He agreed to formalize his documentation and share it when the time came. Over the following months, I quietly approached 3 other current employees and 2 former employees who had left Helix during Marcus's tenure. Not all of them agreed to participate. 2 of the current employees declined, citing concerns about their careers. I understood and did not press. But the 5 who agreed, Priya, James, a project manager named Sophia Reyes, a junior analyst named Kevin Tran, and a former senior analyst named Danielle Voss, who had left for a competitor in 2021, together formed a body of testimony that was both comprehensive and deeply damaging. I also took a step that I knew was risky but necessary. In November of 2022, I used a personal email account to contact Douglas A. Parrish, the registered agent for all 3 phantom vendors. I posed as a business consultant interested in partnering with his companies and requested introductory materials. Parrish responded with a generic brochure that contained no meaningful information about any consulting services. What it did contain was a phone number. I did not call it, but I ran a reverse lookup and confirmed that the number was associated with a prepaid mobile phone, a burner in common parlance. That was consistent with my theory that Parrish was a proxy, not a principal, and that Marcus was the actual beneficiary of the payments. The 18 months of documentation were, by far, the most demanding period of my professional life. Not because the work was technically difficult, though it required careful attention to detail, but because of the psychological toll of working alongside a man I knew to be a fraud, smiling at him in meetings, answering his emails, and pretending that everything was normal. There were moments when I nearly broke. In February of 2023, Marcus gave a presentation at an industry conference in San Francisco that was based, almost word for word, on a white paper I had written the previous autumn. The presentation was well received. It was covered by a trade publication. Marcus's LinkedIn was flooded with congratulatory messages. I sat in my apartment, reading the coverage on my laptop, and felt a wave of resentment so intense that I had to put the computer down and walk around the block 3 times before I could trust myself to think clearly. But I did not act prematurely. I returned to my desk, opened the spreadsheet, and added another entry to the credit theft registry. The system held, the discipline held. I kept collecting. By the spring of 2023, the total amount diverted to the 3 phantom vendors had surpassed $900,000. The payments had accelerated in recent months, which I attributed to Marcus's growing confidence. Confidence born of the fact that no one, in nearly 3 years, had questioned a single transaction. I suspected he had begun to believe he was untouchable. I intended to disabuse him of that notion. I also noticed, during this period, that Marcus had begun to exhibit behavioral patterns consistent with a person who is living beyond their legitimate means. He arrived at work in a new car, a black BMW 7 Series that was well above the salary range of a VP at a mid-sized tech company. He wore a Patek Philippe watch that I estimated, based on a cursory internet search, to be worth approximately $35,000. He mentioned, in a team meeting, that he had recently purchased a vacation property in Santa Fe. These observations were not evidence, but they were corroborating details that painted a picture of a man enjoying the proceeds of his fraud. I recorded all of this in the Personal Journal tab, alongside my reflections on the ethics of what I was doing. Was I violating Marcus's privacy by noting his watch and his car? I did not believe so. These were public observations, made in the course of normal workplace interaction. Was I exceeding my authority by analyzing vendor payment data that was technically within my job responsibilities but not part of any assigned project? I argued that the analysis was within the scope of my duties as a data analyst responsible for financial performance reporting. Was I engaging in a form of surveillance that could be construed as harassment? No. I was observing, recording, and analyzing. Precisely the skills I had been hired to exercise. The ethical calculus, in the end, was straightforward. Marcus Webb was stealing from the company. He was defrauding his colleagues. He was undermining the integrity of the organization. The money he was diverting, money that by the spring of 2023 had exceeded $1 million, belonged to Helix's shareholders, employees, and clients. My documentation was an act of institutional self-defense. The board meeting was scheduled for March 28, 2024. It was the quarterly board meeting, the same quarterly board meeting at which, for the past 3 years, Marcus had presented his team's analytical work to the directors. The meeting would be attended by all 7 members of the board, the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and the general counsel. It would be held in the large conference room on the 14th floor of Helix's Austin headquarters, beginning at 9 in the morning. I had been preparing for this meeting since the previous September. The presentation blueprint tab had grown to more than 50 pages of detailed notes, slide designs, and scripted talking points. I had rehearsed my presentation, silently, in my apartment, standing in front of a mirror, more times than I could count. I knew the evidence as well as I knew my own name. Every number, every date, every name, every connection. The plan was simple in concept, but intricate in execution. I would not crash the meeting. I would not send an anonymous email. I would not make a scene in the hallway. Instead, I had arranged, through a series of careful, deliberate steps, to be invited to present at the board meeting as part of the normal agenda. Here is how I did it. In January of 2024, I had proposed to Marcus that the data analytics team should present its annual impact report directly to the board, rather than having the results filtered through his VP-level summary. I framed it as a professional development opportunity and chance for the team to gain visibility with senior leadership. I provided a draft agenda and offered to do the bulk of the preparation work. Marcus, who was not accustomed to doing preparation work, agreed immediately. I suspect he viewed it as a low-effort way to appear generous and forward-thinking. He told the CEO that his team would be presenting at the March board meeting, and Catherine Osei, who had been encouraging greater team-level participation in board reviews, approved the addition to the agenda. I was given a 30-minute slot, beginning at 10:15 a.m., following the CFO's financial review and preceding the strategic planning discussion. Marcus would introduce me. I would present. He would summarize and take questions. That was the plan as he understood it. He did not know that my presentation would last approximately 25 minutes, that the final 10 minutes would be devoted to a subject he had not authorized, and that the 4 people I had invited to observe from the back of the room, Priya, James, Sophia, and Kevin, were there not to support the presentation, but to provide immediate, first-hand corroboration if challenged. I also made one additional preparation that I believe was critical to the outcome. On March 25th, 3 days before the meeting, I sent a confidential package via certified mail to Helix's general counsel, a meticulous attorney named Robert Chen. The package contained a printed copy of my full evidentiary dossier, along with a cover letter explaining that I intended to present the findings at the board meeting and requesting that legal counsel be present to ensure the company's interests were properly represented. I asked for legal coverage. Robert Chen called me on the evening of March 26. His voice was measured and careful. "I've reviewed the materials you sent," he said. "This is very serious." "Yes," I said. "How long have you been collecting this evidence?" 18 months. A pause. "And you're certain of your findings?" "I am certain enough to present them to the board of directors." Another pause. "I'll be at the meeting," he said. "I'll also be bringing our outside counsel, from Whitfield and Associates. I'd recommend you be very precise in your presentation, very precise and very calm." "I intend to be," I said. March 28, 2024, was a Thursday. The weather in Austin was mild, clear skies, 68 degrees, the kind of day that makes you glad you live in Texas. I woke at 5 in the morning, as was my habit, and spent an hour reviewing my notes. I ate breakfast, I dressed carefully, a charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie, polished shoes. I wanted to look professional, but not theatrical. This was not a performance. It was an execution. I arrived at the office at 7:30, an hour and a half before the meeting was scheduled to begin. I set up my laptop in the conference room, tested the projector and the screen, and loaded my presentation. The deck was 72 slides long. The first 45 slides contained the legitimate portion of the presentation, a thorough, well-designed overview of the analytics team's contributions over the previous year. The remaining 27 slides were the takedown. At 9 o'clock, the board members began to file in. I knew all of them by reputation, though I had only met a few in person. Catherine Osei, the CEO, sat at the head of the table. Robert Chen, the general counsel, sat to her left, alongside a woman I recognized as Patricia Whitfield, the founding partner of the outside counsel firm. The CFO, a stern man named Gerald Hoffman, sat across the table. The 7 board members, 3 venture capital representatives, 2 independent directors, and 2 company insiders, settled into their chairs with the practiced ease of people who had attended hundreds of such meetings. Marcus arrived at 9:15, wearing one of his navy blazers and his Patek Philippe. He shook hands around the table, exchanged pleasantries, and took his seat near the head of the room. He looked, as he always did, supremely confident. I waited in the back of the room, standing near the door. Priya, James, Sophia, and Kevin were seated along the wall behind me, each carrying a folder of corroborating documents. None of us spoke. We did not need to. We had rehearsed this moment in our minds 1,000 times. The meeting proceeded through its early agenda items. The CFO presented the quarterly financial results. Revenue was up 12% year over year, operating margins had improved, and the company's cash position was strong. Gerald Hoffman was thorough and professional, though I noticed that his review of vendor spending was notably brief. I suspected this was because Marcus's phantom vendor payments were buried in the broader consulting services line item, where they were too small individually to attract attention, but collectively represented a significant sum. At 10:15, Marcus stood and walked to the front of the room. Good morning, everyone, he said, with the easy warmth that was his trademark. I'm delighted to introduce a presentation from our strategic analytics team, showcasing the incredible work they've done over the past year. I'd like to hand things over to one of our senior analysts, who has been instrumental in driving our data capabilities forward. He gestured toward me. I walked to the front of the room, connected my laptop, and began. The first 45 minutes of my presentation were, by design, unremarkable. I walked the board through our team's key achievements: the churn prediction model, the pricing optimization framework, the operational efficiency audit, the real-time reporting pipeline, and a half-dozen other projects. I used clear visuals, precise language, and concrete metrics. The board members nodded along. A few took notes. Catherine Osei smiled at one point, clearly pleased with the results. What I did not do, at any point during the first 45 minutes, was claim credit for the work. Instead, I was meticulous about attribution. This model was developed by James Okonkwo, our senior financial analyst. The pipeline architecture was designed and implemented by Priya Mehta, our lead data engineer. Sophia Reyes managed the cross-functional coordination that made this project possible. I could feel Marcus shift in his seat. The attribution was subtle enough that it might have passed unnoticed if he hadn't been listening for it. But he was listening. I knew he would be. At the 45-minute mark, I clicked to slide 46. The background color changed from Helix's standard blue to a neutral gray. The header read, Supplementary Analysis, Vendor Payment Anomalies. Before I conclude, I said, I'd like to draw the board's attention to a matter that arose during the course of our routine vendor spending analysis. I want to emphasize that this is not part of the prepared agenda, and I want to thank Marcus for allowing me the flexibility to include it. The room was quiet. Marcus's face was unreadable, but I could see his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Over the past 18 months, I continued, I have identified a pattern of vendor payments that I believe warrants the board's immediate attention. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a time series chart of payments to the 3 phantom vendors, overlaid with a comparison of payments to legitimate consulting firms. The chart told the story with devastating clarity. The 3 vendors, Tessera Consulting Group, Meridian Analytics Partners, and Northlight Data Services, had received a combined total of $1.1 million over the period in question. The payments were irregular, lacked supporting documentation, and had all been authorized by a single individual. Marcus, I said, turning to face him directly, can you tell the board what services Tessera Consulting Group provided to Helix Data Systems? The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the hum of the HVAC system. I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Congress Avenue below. I could hear my own heartbeat. Marcus looked at me. His eyes were cold. Tessera is one of our external consulting partners, he said. They provide supplementary analytical capacity when our internal team is... How many people work at Tessera Consulting Group? I asked. I don't have that information at my fingertips. I do, I said. 0. Tessera Consulting Group has no employees. It has no office. It has no website, no LinkedIn presence, and no client references. It is a shell company, registered to a virtual office on South Congress Avenue, using a registered agent named Douglas A. Parrish, who is also the registered agent for Meridian Analytics Partners and Northlight Data Services. I clicked to the next slide. It showed the Texas Secretary of State filings for all 3 companies, side by side. The registered agent's name and address were highlighted in red. The incorporation dates were highlighted in blue. The business purposes, nearly identical across all 3 filings, were highlighted in yellow. Each of these companies was incorporated within a 12-month period beginning in June of 2020, I said. Each lists the same registered agent. Each receives payments from Helix into accounts at the same regional bank, and each payment is authorized by the same person in this room. I did not say Marcus's name. I did not need to. Every person in the room was looking at him. Marcus stood up. His face had gone from cold to something approaching panic, though he was fighting to maintain composure. These are legitimate vendors. They've been approved through our procurement. They have not been approved through procurement, I said, my voice perfectly level. They are not in the approved vendor registry. They have no contracts on file. There are no statements of work, no deliverables, and no project codes associated with any of their invoices. I have reviewed all 73 invoices, and not a single one describes specific services rendered. I clicked to the next slide. It showed the invoices, reduced to thumbnails, arranged in a grid. The formatting similarities were immediately apparent. Same layout, same fonts, same vague language. These invoices were generated from the same template, I said. I have confirmed this through metadata analysis. Several of the invoices show creation dates that are inconsistent with the dates printed on the documents themselves. Catherine Osei spoke for the first time. Marcus, do you have a response to this? Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. Catherine, this is clearly an attempt by a disgruntled employee to... I'm not finished, I said. It was the first time in my life I had interrupted a vice president, and it felt extraordinary. I'd like to address the matter of attribution as well, because I believe it is relevant to understanding the full scope of what has occurred. I clicked to the next slide. It was a simple table, 2 columns. The left column listed 12 major analytical deliverables produced by the strategic analytics team over the previous 2 years. The right column listed the person who had actually done the work. My name appeared 4 times. Priya's appeared 3 times. James's appeared 3 times. Sophia's appeared twice. Marcus's name did not appear at all. Each of these deliverables, I said, was presented to this board, to the executive leadership team, or to external stakeholders as the work of Vice President Marcus Webb. In no case was the actual author credited. I have documentation, commit logs, design documents, email threads, and timestamped file records that conclusively establishes the true authorship of every item on this list. I paused and looked at the board. My colleagues and I have spent 18 months building this case. We have done so quietly and carefully because we wanted to be certain, absolutely certain, that what we were seeing was real. It is real. Marcus Webb has been systematically stealing credit for the work of his team and diverting company funds to shell companies under his control. The total amount exceeds $1 million. I turned to Robert Chen. General Counsel, I provided you with the complete evidentiary dossier on Monday. Can you confirm that you've had an opportunity to review it? Robert Chen nodded. I have, along with our outside counsel. The documentation is thorough and, in our preliminary assessment, compelling. We will be recommending an immediate forensic investigation by an independent firm, and we will be coordinating with law enforcement as appropriate. Marcus sat down. He said nothing. The color had drained from his face, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked small. The blazer, the watch, the practiced charisma, all of it was gone, replaced by the blank, stunned expression of a man who has just watched his world collapse in real time. Catherine Osei stood. Marcus, I need you to step out of this meeting. Robert will accompany you to your office, where you are to remain until further notice. Your access to company systems will be suspended effective immediately. Marcus stood, buttoned his blazer, a reflexive gesture, almost mechanical, and walked out of the room without a word. Robert Chen followed him. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click. The room was silent for a long moment. Then one of the independent directors, a woman named Dr. Elaine Stafford, who had been on the board for 8 years, said, I'd like to hear from the other team members, please. Priya stood, James stood, Sophia stood, Kevin stood. One by one, they told their stories, briefly, precisely, without theatrics. Each confirmed a portion of the evidence I had presented. Each described instances of credit theft. Each expressed confidence in the accuracy of the financial analysis. Dr. Stafford looked at me. You said 18 months. Yes. That is an extraordinary display of patience and discipline. I'm a data analyst, I said. Patience and discipline are the job. She almost smiled. Well, I think we owe you and your team a considerable apology and an equally considerable debt of gratitude. Marcus Webb was terminated on March 29, 2024, the day after the board meeting. The termination was effective immediately, and it was classified as for cause, which meant that Marcus forfeited his unvested equity, his deferred compensation, and his eligibility for severance. The total financial impact on Marcus was, by my estimate, in excess of $2 million, far more than he had stolen. The forensic investigation, conducted by Whitfield and Associates in coordination with the Austin Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, confirmed every element of my analysis. Douglas A. Parrish was interviewed by investigators and, faced with the evidence, cooperated fully. He confirmed that Marcus had created the 3 shell companies and had paid Parrish a small monthly fee to serve as the registered agent. The bank accounts, it turned out, had been opened using Marcus's personal information, with Parrish listed as an authorized signatory. The money had flowed directly to Marcus. In May of 2024, a Travis County grand jury indicted Marcus Webb on 7 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of theft by a public servant, and 2 counts of forgery. The case was prosecuted by the Texas Attorney General's office, and Marcus pleaded guilty in September, accepting a sentence of 4 years in state prison and an order of full restitution. At Helix, the aftermath was swift and, in many ways, invigorating. Catherine Osei conducted a comprehensive review of the company's procurement and financial controls, implementing new safeguards that would have made Marcus's scheme impossible to execute. She also established a formal credit attribution policy, requiring that all presentations to the board and external stakeholders include the names of all contributors to the work being presented. Priya was promoted to Director of Data Engineering. James was promoted to Senior Manager of Financial Analytics. Sophia was given leadership of a new cross-functional strategy team. Kevin was promoted to the Senior Analyst role that I had nominally occupied. I was offered the position of Vice President of Strategic Analytics, Marcus's old job. I thought about the offer for a long time. I consulted with Priya, with James, with my partner, and with the personal journal tab of my spreadsheet, which I reread in its entirety one quiet Sunday afternoon. In the end, I accepted the title but negotiated a different scope of responsibility. I did not want to manage people the way Marcus had managed us. I wanted to build something better, a team culture in which credit was shared, transparency was the default, and the kind of systematic deception Marcus had practiced was not merely prohibited, but culturally impossible. People ask me, sometimes, whether I feel guilty about what I did, whether the 18 months of secret documentation, the careful cultivation of alliances, the calculated confrontation in front of the board, whether any of it bothers me in retrospect. The answer is no, not even slightly. Marcus Webb chose his path. He chose to steal the work of his subordinates and present it as his own. He chose to create fictitious companies and siphon money from the organization that employed him. He chose to lie, repeatedly and systematically, to his colleagues, his superiors, and his board of directors. He did this not out of desperation or necessity, but out of greed and ego, the desire to appear more important, more capable, more brilliant than he actually was. I chose a different path. I chose patience. I chose precision. I chose to build a case so thorough, so airtight, so meticulously documented, that when the moment of confrontation arrived, there was nothing Marcus could do, no lie he could tell, no defense he could mount, no ally he could call upon, that would save him. The spreadsheet did not eat my boss. I did. The spreadsheet was merely the instrument, a tool, like any other, that amplifies the capability of the person who wields it. Marcus underestimated me. He underestimated all of us. He saw data analysts as functionaries, as cogs in a machine whose output he could appropriate at will. He never imagined that one of those cogs might be watching, measuring, and recording. I think about that sometimes. About the arrogance of underestimating people. About the quiet, meticulous individuals who sit in open-plan offices and cubicles, doing the work that makes organizations function, rarely receiving credit and almost never complaining. About what happens when one of those individuals decides, calmly and rationally, that they have had enough. If you are reading this and you are in a situation similar to the one I was in, watching someone steal your work, or your company's resources, or your colleagues' contributions, let me offer this advice. Do not react. Do not rage. Do not confront. Instead, open a spreadsheet, start documenting. Be precise, be thorough, and be patient. The data, as I have said many times in my career, always tells a story. You just need to arrange it properly. And when you are ready, when the evidence is complete, the timeline is airtight, and the moment is right, you will find that the most devastating weapon in your arsenal is not anger. It is competence. Marcus Webb learned that lesson the hard way. I hope, for his sake, that he had time to reflect on it during those long months between his arrest and his sentencing. I doubt it. Narcissists rarely reflect. But the data reflects for them, whether they want it to or not. The spreadsheet is closed now. The external hard drive is in a drawer in my desk at home, a souvenir of a chapter I have no intention of reopening. I have a new job, a new team, and a new set of challenges. The work continues. The data continues. And somewhere in Austin, in a state correctional facility, a man in a navy blazer is learning what it feels like to be on the wrong end of an analysis. I would be lying if I said I didn't find that satisfying. I am, after all, only human. But satisfaction, I have learned, is best served cold, measured in rows and columns, documented over months, and delivered with the quiet precision of a well-constructed spreadsheet. The spreadsheet that ate my boss. It has a nice ring to it. I think I'll keep it.